At the family dinner, Dad raised his champagne glass high. "I am proud of all my children," he announced, letting the silence hang for a cruel second. Except the loser sitting at the table, everyone laughed. Zachary clinked his glass against Dad's. I didn't react. Panic is for people who haven't read the fine print. I simply stood up, placed a heavy leather portfolio on the center of the table, and leaned in close. "For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day." Then I turned, walked outside, took the keys to the vintage Mustang I had restored for him, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I heard it, a scream of pure, unadulterated terror. Before we see what was inside that folder, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I did not speed. Speeding implies a loss of control, and I was operating with absolute precision. I kept the 1968 Mustang at a steady 45 miles per hour as the gravel of the lake house driveway crunched beneath the tires one last time. In the rearview mirror, the sprawling estate, a property my father had leveraged to the hilt to maintain the appearance of solvency, shrank into a postcard-sized image of chaos. I could see them. Tiny, frantic figures on the manicured lawn. My father was still screaming, though the sound was swallowed by the distance and the throaty rumble of the V8 engine. My mother was likely clutching her chest, falling back into her habitual role of the peacemaker, who never actually made peace. Tyler and Zachary were probably already scrambling for their phones, realizing that the corporate credit cards in their wallets were about to be declined. Speaking of phones, mine was currently vibrating against the passenger seat leather like a dying heart. Notification after notification lit up the screen. I did not look. I did not need to read the text to know the script. First would come the confusion, then the accusations of ingratitude, then the threats, and finally, the bargaining. It was a predictable market cycle, and I had already liquidated my position. People talk about the heartbreak of walking away from your family. They describe the tears blurring your vision, the hesitation, the urge to turn the car around. But my eyes were dry. The road ahead was crystal clear. My hands on the steering wheel were not shaking. They were steady, absorbing the vibration of $120,000 of vintage machinery. I had spent 2 years restoring this car. I had hunted down original parts, negotiated with collectors, and supervised the engine rebuild myself. It was supposed to be a tribute to a man who respected horsepower more than he respected his daughter. Now, it was just an asset, a tangible return on an emotional investment that had gone bankrupt decades ago. The smell of old leather and lake water filled the cabin, a sensory collision of the past I was leaving and the vehicle that was carrying me out of it. I did not drive to my apartment. I did not go to a friend's house to mourn over a bottle of wine. I drove straight to the city. The skyline rose up to meet me, a grid of steel and glass where things made sense. In construction, there is a logic. Load-bearing walls support the structure. If a pillar is rotten, you do not paint over it, you remove it. You reinforce the foundation. That is what I had just done. I pulled into the underground garage of my firm. The silence down here was different. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of the family dinner table where words were weapons. It was the clean, cool silence of concrete. I killed the engine. The Mustang shuddered and went still. I picked up my phone, finally glancing at the screen. 47 missed calls, 12 voicemails, a wall of noise I could delete with a single swipe. I took the elevator up to the 24th floor. My keycard beeped, a sharp digital sound of access. I walked into my office, the air conditioning humming a low, steady note. I sat in my chair, the leather cool against my back. I placed the keys to the Mustang on the desk next to my blueprints. I didn't leave that barbecue because I was hurt. I left because the deal was closed. For years, I had been the unseen architect of my father's empire. While Tyler and Zachary were busy expensing client dinners and scouting locations on golf courses, I was in the trenches. Renegotiating supplier contracts at 2 in the morning became my routine. Finding the structural flaws in the blueprints before the concrete was poured was my responsibility. Quietly transferring funds from my personal savings to cover payroll when the company accounts ran dry was my secret burden. My father saw the finished buildings, the ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the photo ops. He never saw the cracks in the foundation that I was desperately patching. He saw my brothers as the future of the company because they looked like him. Loud, confident, taking up space. He saw me as the support staff, the reliable daughter who was good with details but lacked the vision to lead. It wasn't loyalty that kept me there. It was a prison without bars. I had spent my entire life conditioned to believe that my silence was the price of admission to this family. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I fixed enough problems, if I saved them enough times, eventually they would see me. Eventually, my father would look at me with the same pride he reserved for his sons. But he never did. The validation I craved was a mirage. I was running on a treadmill of expectation, fueled by the hope that one day I would be enough. It took me 29 years to realize that enough was a moving target I would never hit. The turning point wasn't a single moment of clarity, but a slow accumulation of insults. It was Tyler getting the promotion I deserved. It was Zachary taking credit for a deal I closed. It was my father dismissing my warnings about the company's liquidity crisis as hysteria. I stopped asking for permission. I stopped waiting for validation. I started looking at the numbers, and the numbers told a terrifying story. The company was drowning in debt. The legacy my father was so obsessed with was leveraged to the hilt. The banks were circling. Bankruptcy wasn't a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty. So, I made a choice. I could let the ship sink, or I could buy the wreckage. I spent months quietly acquiring the debt. I liquidated my own assets, leveraged my personal credit, and negotiated with creditors who were happy to unload the risk. I became the majority stakeholder in my father's failure. I didn't do it to destroy him. I did it because I was the only one who could save it. But saving it meant taking control. It meant proving once and for all that the loser sitting at the table was the only one playing the game. The silence in my office felt different now. It wasn't the silence of waiting, it was the silence of ownership. I looked at the acquisition papers in the portfolio. The ink was dry. The transfer was legal. The company was mine. My office phone began to ring. The shrill sound cut through the quiet, insistent and demanding. The red light on the console blinked rapidly. Line 1, line 2, line 3. They were all calling. I watched it for a moment, the rhythm of the flashing light almost hypnotic. First, a text from my mother. "Please, Morgan, Dad is beside himself. Just give the car back. We can fix this." Then a voicemail from Robert. I pressed play, letting his voice fill the room. "You ungrateful little. You think you can steal my legacy? I'll sue you for everything you're worth. You better fix this before I call the police." And, finally, a text from Tyler. "You snake, we're coming down there." I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the familiar wave of guilt that usually accompanied their disapproval. Instead, I felt a strange detachment. They weren't family anymore. They were liabilities. Their threats were noise. Their anger was irrelevant. I reached for the office printer and began to print transcripts of the voicemails and screenshots of the texts. The pages slid out into the tray, warm and crisp evidence. I added them to the growing file on my desk labeled Transition. The phone rang again. This time, the cord came out of the wall with a plastic snap. The ringing stopped instantly. The silence returned, heavier this time, but cleaner. I walked over to the organizational chart on the wall. It was a large whiteboard filled with names and titles in magnetic strips. At the top, in the center, was Robert, CEO. Below him, Tyler, VP of Operations, and Zachary, VP of Business Development. My name wasn't even on the board. I was listed under Support Staff in the company directory. Robert's magnet came away with a satisfying click. I dropped it into the trash can. Then I removed Tyler and Zachary. Click, click, into the trash. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a new magnet I had ordered weeks ago. White letters on a black background. Morgan, CEO. I placed it at the top of the pyramid. It looked right. It looked balanced. The elevator dinged in the hallway. Voices raised an argument. Heavy footsteps approaching. The siege had begun. But they were storming a fortress that had already changed commanders. I sat back in my chair, steepled my fingers, and waited for the door to open. The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and tension. The external auditors, I had hired a team of forensic accountants who specialized in corporate autopsies, had been working for 6 hours straight. The legal team sat on the other side of the long mahogany table, silent, watching the projection screen where the company's financial entrails were being displayed. I stood by the window looking out at the city grid. I had expected to find incompetence. I knew Robert was bad at math and worse at management. I knew Tyler and Zachary treated the corporate accounts like a personal piggy bank for golf trips and luxury leases. I was prepared to fire them for negligence. I was prepared to restructure the debt and slowly bleed the poison out of the ledger. But then the lead auditor cleared his throat. It was a dry, hesitant sound that cut through the low hum of the projector. He asked me to look at line item 402. I turned. On the screen was a series of invoices for concrete supplies. Thousands of tons of concrete supposedly poured into the foundation of the new waterfront high-rise project. Line item 402 told a different story. There was a discrepancy, a massive one. The invoices were for $3 million more material than we had actually used. I walked closer to the screen. My eyes traced the vendor names. Apex Supply, TZ Logistics, Zenith Materials. They sounded legitimate, but when I asked the auditor to pull the incorporation documents for these vendors, the truth spilled out like wet cement. They were shell companies, all of them registered to P.O. boxes in Nevada. And the signatories? Tyler and Zachary. The room seemed to tilt. This wasn't just incompetence. This wasn't just boys being boys with the company credit card. This was embezzlement, systematic, cold-blooded theft. My brothers weren't just lazy executives riding Dad's coattails. They were actively gutting the animal while it was still alive. I sat down, the leather chair groaning under the sudden weight of the realization. I swiped through the files on the tablet. It got worse. There were emails, drafts of a liquidation plan. They weren't trying to save the company. They were fattening their own parachutes. They had a plan to sell the firm for parts, bankrupt the main entity to clear the liabilities. Liabilities that would have destroyed our father's personal assets, and walk away with the cash in their offshore accounts. They were going to leave Robert with nothing. The father who worshipped them, who handed them titles they didn't earn and salaries they didn't deserve, was going to be left holding the bag for their crimes. He would have lost the lake house, his pension, his reputation, everything. And he never saw it coming because he was too busy looking down on me. The numbers on the screen blurred, but the truth was sharp as a knife. I hadn't just executed a hostile takeover, I had intercepted a murder weapon. I looked at the lawyer. I didn't need to ask if we had enough. We had enough to send them to prison for 10 years. The anger I had felt earlier, the hot, resentful burn of being the loser, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, heavy duty. I wasn't just taking the company to spite them. I was the only thing standing between my family's legacy and a concrete tomb. I reconnected the phone line and dialed the head of security. I told him to lock them out. Not just from the building, but from the servers, from the accounts, from everything. The siege was over. Now it was time for the execution. The double doors to my office flew open, slamming against the wall with a violence that made the glass rattle in the frames. Robert stood there, his face a mask of purple rage, veins bulging in his neck. He looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the expensive suit he usually wore for meetings. Now just an angry man in a polo shirt that was slightly too tight. "Undo it!" he screamed, advancing toward my desk. "Undo it right now, Morgan. You think you can just steal my company? My life? I built this? Me, not you. You're nothing but a glorified secretary." I remained a statue behind the desk. My hands rested on the cool surface, steady and unmoving. The silence in the room was heavy, insulated by the soundproofing I had installed years ago to block out the construction noise below. Now it blocked out his bluster. "Are you listening to me?" he roared, slamming his fist onto the edge of the desk. "I am your father. You owe me everything. I gave you this job. I gave you a roof over your head, and this is how you repay me?" By stabbing me in the back. I reached for the file, the thick bound report the auditors had just finalized. The cover was simple: Internal Financial Audit and Forensic Analysis. I slid it across the mahogany surface until it rested just within his reach. "Read it," I said. My voice was calm, almost bored. "I'm not reading your garbage," he spat. "I'm calling the police. I'm calling the board. You're fired. You hear me? Fired." "You can't fire me, Dad," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You don't work here anymore, and neither do your sons. Read the report." Something in my tone, the absolute lack of fear, made him pause. His eyes flicked to the document. He snatched it up, his hands shaking so hard the pages rustled like dry leaves. He flipped it open, scanning the executive summary. I watched him. I watched the moment the air left his lungs. I watched his eyes widen, then narrow, then widen again as the numbers sank in. The shell companies, the siphoned funds, the liquidation plan, the dates, the amounts, the signatures. Tyler, Zachary. Tyler, Zachary. Over and over again. He flipped the pages faster now, desperate to find a mistake, a lie, anything that would prove me wrong. But the evidence was relentless. It was math, and math doesn't care about your feelings. He dropped the report. It hit the desk with a heavy thud, the sound of a gavel coming down. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him truly look at me. Not past me, not through me. And what I saw in his eyes wasn't anger anymore. They were going to sell it?" he whispered. "Sell it for parts? They were going to bankrupt you?" I said, "They were going to take the cash, leave you with the debt, and let the bank take the lake house. They were going to leave you with nothing." He staggered back, collapsing into the chair opposite me, the chair reserved for clients, for people who needed something. He looked down at his hands, aging and spotted. He looked like a man who had just realized the castle he lived in was made of sand, and the tide had already come in. "But they're my boys," he said, his voice cracking. "I gave them everything. I taught them everything. You taught them that they were entitled to everything without earning it, I said. You taught them that appearances mattered more than substance. You taught them that I was the help and they were the heirs. They just followed your lesson plan to its logical conclusion. He put his head in his hands and began to weep. It was an ugly, jagged sound, a lifetime of ego dissolving into a puddle of regret. I watched him cry, and I felt nothing. No pity, no triumph, just a clinical observation of a structural failure. You called me a loser, Dad, I said softly. You laughed at me in front of everyone. But I'm the only one who didn't sell you out. I bought your debt. I saved your legacy, not because you deserved it, but because I wasn't going to let them win. He looked up, tears streaking his face. Morgan, I said, standing up. Don't apologize. It's too late. The company is mine. You have a stipend. It's generous. It's enough to keep the lake house if you budget, but you have no power here. I walked to the door and held it open. Go home, Dad. Tyler and Zachary will be receiving their termination notices via courier. I suggest you don't answer their calls. He stood up shaky and gray. He looked at me one last time, a mix of shame and awe in his eyes. Then he walked out. A king without a crown, leaving his empire in the hands of the daughter he never saw coming. The dust settled, the noise stopped, and finally I could hear myself think. 6 months later, I walked through the active construction site of the new downtown library, a project my brothers had deemed unprofitable, but which was now the crown jewel of our portfolio. I wore a hard hat and steel-toed boots, standing on the rebar-reinforced concrete that would soon be the foundation of something lasting. The air smelled of wet cement and progress. I was the CEO. It wasn't just a title on a magnet anymore, it was a reality forged in fire. I hadn't just maintained the old ways, I had dismantled them. The toxic culture of expense account lunches and good old boy nepotism was gone, replaced by efficiency, transparency, and merit. I hired people who knew how to build, not just how to talk. I promoted the quiet ones, the workers who stayed late to check the specs, the ones who reminded me of who I used to be. Robert lived quietly now. He kept the lake house thanks to the stipend I authorized, but he never visited the office. We didn't have Sunday dinners. We didn't exchange holiday cards. The silence between us was permanent, a wall neither of us tried to climb. Tyler and Zachary were facing indictments. Their legal battles would drag on for years, a slow public unraveling of their entitlement. I felt no joy in it, only the grim satisfaction of a ledger finally balanced. I looked up at the steel beams rising against the blue sky. I realized then that my revenge wasn't the destruction of my family, it was the correction of their mistakes. I didn't burn the field, I plowed it. I turned over the soil, removed the rocks, and planted something that could actually grow. I saved the jobs of 300 employees. I saved the reputation of a company that had been built on my grandfather's sweat before my father nearly drowned it in his ego. My victory wasn't about the car or the title or even the look on my father's face when he realized he had lost. It was about this: standing on solid ground, knowing that everything around me, the steel, the concrete, the future, was held up by my own 2 hands. I had built my own table because they wouldn't give me a seat. And looking around at the view from the head of it, I knew I would never be hungry again. If you've ever had to build your own table because they wouldn't give you a seat, share this story and tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you're building in silence right now?